Welcome to Canon Conversation number 1006. Question I got: do you have any advice for parents trying to raise young children? What do you do? Boy, that's a tough one, especially in this day and age. What I will tell you first off is God's will is for all men to be saved and to come into the knowledge of the truth. So the most important thing you can instill in your children is that they are sinners, and no matter how good they are, 'cause believe me, I was a good boy, but I was still a sinner. No matter how good they are, they're sinners, and that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again as atonement for their sin. And once they learn that, the most important thing you can teach them is to come into the knowledge of the truth, to get the sound doctrine, specifically from Paul's epistles in the inner man. Now I realize, if you got a 5-year-old, you're not going to have a 5-year-old where you're, got all this deep doctrine from Ephesians that you're going to be teaching them, but you can still teach them the basics. And you know your child, you know what your child can handle, what he can't handle. So, but this is the most important part, and it's important for us to understand that. It's the spiritual well-being of your child, because a lot of times parents raise kids, and the main thing, and of course as a parent you want to make sure you do this as well, the main thing, they make sure that they don't get involved in drugs, they don't hang out with the wrong people, and they don't get involved in sexual activity at an early age, before they're married. So those are the main things. If they can control their sexual urges, especially when they're teenagers, and realize that sex is only for marriage and only, confine it to that. And if they make sure they don't get involved in drugs and hang out with the wrong crowds, you've done a lot as far as being a parent to help them in this life. That's the two biggest things I would think. But the problem is that there's such a focus when you're a parent. It's very easy to just, and even saved parents do this. It's very easy just to focus on this world. So you think, okay, I don't want them to have sex before marriage. I don't want them to get involved in drugs. I don't want them involved in the wrong crowds. Then you go beyond that and say, well, I want them to study, do their homework, get good grades, then go to college or technical school, or be whatever, get involved in whatever they want to do to make a good living, a good job. I think, personally, when I look at it, of course, it's all about what your child is, what their skills are and what they can do. My advice would be to get involved in a technical school in high school. I know for us, we've got a program that high schoolers can enroll in and learn a trade, so that when they graduate from high school, they got that trade. And that is very important in this society that doesn't want to work, because for me to get a plumber or an electrician or a roofer, it's not easy to find that, and it's hard to find a good one, and they're expensive. There's been so much focus on just going to college that all these necessary things for the house that people need, people don't know how to do that stuff, because all they do is read books. They're not actually becoming plumbers and electricians and roofers. So I would say point your children to a trade like that. So that's what parents usually do, and they're so worried about the moral stuff. Which, as parents, you don't want you don't want your kids involved in premarital sex, or to get involved in drugs, or to get involved in gangs, or get involved in fights and all this stuff. That's true. But it's so easy to worry about that stuff and forget all about the spiritual well-being, because like I said, even if they're a good person, supposedly good, none of us are good, but even if they do good in terms of going to school, getting good grades, getting a good job afterward, and not getting in trouble with the law and all that, if they've never recognized their sin and trusted in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection as atonement for their sin, it won't do them a bit of good. The things that we tend to focus on, especially as parents, are things in this life, and our primary focus should be on the spiritual, especially not training them about just, you want them to have good morals, and you've got to have rules, I understand that, but get them to understand that the most important thing is believing the gospel and getting sound doctrine from Paul's epistles in their inner man and using the mind of Christ, applying it. That's the most important thing you could ever do for your child. Even if your child gets involved in all kinds of trouble, in and out of jail, has all kinds of problems in this life, all those problems are going to go away in life to come. So the most important thing is what you can instill in them spiritually. And a lot of times, because parents are so focused on the physical and having a good life here, at least staying out of trouble, that it's very easy for parents to not focus on the spiritual. And especially because the problem is, and this is what most Christians do, is because churchianity is focused on this life, then usually the church-going parents end up getting their children, giving them stricter rules, being harder on them morally speaking. And then the children, they end up rebelling. So then the church that they had to go to as a child, but now they're an adult, now they're in college. That's usually the first thing that happens in a very legalistic type setting where the parents has so many rules and very hard on the kids when they're teenagers. Is the first thing is their flesh wants to rebel. So once they go off to college, then they get involved in sex and getting drunk and doing all these things that college people do. But if you've got them grounded in the spiritual part, recognizing their sin, trusting Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection as atonement for their sin, have the morals, but when they go against it, teach them grace. I'm not saying you can't punish your kids. Certainly you need to do that to keep them in line. But you're the parent, and you know how your child responds to punishment. The thing about having kids is as they grow up, you learn as parents as well. So you grow up with them, learning how to deal with them. So you know what works best for them. So I can't give a blanket statement on what you do. But I would say that don't be so hard on them physically, because it's more important to have the spiritual. When they do something that's morally wrong, just spanking them or grounding them or giving them a timeout or whatever it is, rather than, you can do that stuff, but rather than doing that, or your focus should be on the lesson learned. This is why I don't want you to do this, because it will cause you trouble in this area. And practice grace with your kids, mercy and grace. God does that with us. So if they know the spiritual, they know the gospel, they're saved, and and get that doctrine in them, that's far more important than making sure they obey all the rules. Because if you teach them grace and you teach them that what's important is the life to come, not this life on earth, and not going by the course of this world by Satan, then what you've done is you've instilled in them some spiritual principles, and they're not obeying you because mom and dad said so, and once I go off to college, I'm going to do whatever I want. Then they're obeying you because they know that you love them and that God is desiring to work in them and bring glory to himself and use them as well, and for them to be rewarded in the heavenly places as well. And so when they see the big picture of that, then when they go off to college, maybe they're not so, they're less likely to rebel because they've got the spiritual background, the spiritual knowledge in there, as opposed to I got to do it because mom and dad says so. And then when I get away from them, boy, I'm going to party. I'm going to do what I want to do. And again, they still may do that. I think especially all teenagers go through a rebellion stage. But the more they understand the gospel, I think you can give the gospel message to a 4-year-old. Especially now, kids are so smart. They can recognize their sin. they can trust that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again as atonement for their sin. Maybe they don't understand all the deep theological parts, elements to that, but they can understand they've done some bad things, and they can trust in Jesus' death to pay for those bad things. When I do the kids' Bible study, I've been doing it for about 5 years now, I guess, I think. And that's one of the things I do every single time. Somehow get that gospel in there, that we've all done some bad things, and God sent his son Jesus, and he died for those bad things. And, maybe they don't get it the first time, but that's why I've done over 200 of these kids' Bible studies, and I share it at each one. So if they watch at least a handful of them and are paying attention, they'll at least understand that concept. So teach the kids they're sinners and that Jesus died for their sins at a very early age, as soon as they can understand stuff, because that's the most important thing. If you only learn one thing in your life, you learn the gospel and believe it. That's the best thing, and you instill that as a parent. That's great. And then, of course, when they're ready for it, then give them doctrine from Paul's epistles. You can teach them basic things like God's love. And as they get older, they can learn doctrine and right division and all that. But just teaching the basic things, that how now that we're saved, how that Christ lives in us, and that we shouldn't obey our own lust but follow Christ. So those are the main things I would say that you do as parents of young children. The other things, more practical, I would say, anything more practical than that, but in this world, things to consider is, and you can see this with the school systems nowadays, they're trying to get more and more control of the kids. The state of California is trying to get it to the point where if a 10-year-old boy, let's say, says he wants to be a girl and taking drugs to make himself a girl, and the parents are disapproving of that, well, then they can take the child away from the parents in California. I don't know if that's passed yet or not, but they're at least trying to do it at the age of 10. So they're trying to take control away from the parents, and have the government do it. And when the government does that, they're not going to teach them the gospel, and they're going to brainwash them that there's no God, teach them that science is their God, they are their own gods, they decide what's morally right or wrong, not God, because there is no God, not your parents. So they're teaching all kinds of bad things at school. So I think the most important thing as parents of young children is to do what you can to get them out of that system. So I would say, if you're in California and you got young kids, do what you can to get out of there. I can tell you, I used to live in California. I can tell you, people that I know who are living here in Alabama, who used to live in California, and the quality of life here is so much better because you're not spending so much on taxes and housing and all that. It's uncommon for parents in California to have to work two jobs, each parent working a full-time job, and even if they make good salary, having one to work day shift and the other to work night shift, because on top of all their other expenses, they can't afford to put their kids in childcare. And why would you want to have your kids in childcare? When you consider what this world is doing. So I would say what you want to do is try to get out of those areas that are really controlling and becoming more communistic, because they're just going to take your kids away from you. If not physically, at least mentally, that's what they're doing with the brainwashing that they're doing in schools. The billions or trillions of dollars that is spent in so-called education is to brainwash kids into the course of this world. It's not about teaching them the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's about brainwashing them into the politically correct policies of woke and council culture and LGBTQ, XYZ, ABC, and all that stuff. So, in other words, what they're doing is they're training them in spiritual wickedness in all these public schools now, rather than spiritual godliness. And so, and the spiritual is most important. So do whatever you can to get your kids out of any public school system and homeschool them, teach them at home. You say, well, I can't afford it. Well, move someplace where you can. If you're in California, move to a place like Alabama, where housing is a whole lot cheaper, probably, I don't know, 20% or 25% of the cost of what it is in California, at least where I am. And I'm down here by the beach. The problem is a lot of times the parents, they don't want to leave the big city like that, is because they like all the conveniences. They like the modern stuff. You know, you look at Lot. Lot was a righteous man, a just man. He's going to be in God's kingdom on earth. The Peter says he was a just man, but he was involved with the things of this world, and he looked at all the attractions of the world in Sodom and Gomorrah, and being materialistic, he followed those things, and look where it got him. So he ended up with probably a wife and kids, and that were all, and their husbands that were all lost and bound for hell. But he could have moved out in the country like Abraham and not had all the material modern conveniences and all that stuff, but maybe the family would have went to heaven instead. Well, for them it's paradise on earth, but they'd had eternal life in God's kingdom as opposed to going to hell. And it's just that one little thing, it's worth it. So my advice is, if you've got young kids, get them out of the public school system, teach them at home, and do whatever you need to do to make sure that happens. Instead of working the two jobs, where one's working the day shift and the other is working night shift, to get them out of childcare, do that so that you can homeschool them. You know, get somebody with a different schedule. My mom was a single parent, and she worked she had a degree, bachelor's degree in accounting, but she took a job that paid her a lot less, and we lived with her parents. And so we didn't have a lot of money, didn't have much to live on, but had enough to get by. And she worked a schedule to where she'd be home. She could pick me up from school and then bring me home from school. And I went to a church-run school, and it wasn't anything. Now, I don't know if you can do that now, because it's a whole lot more expensive to do all that now as opposed to back then. But work it out somehow where you can, and not that you have to, I mean, you can either teach your kids. You say, well, I don't know all that geometry and trigonometry and all the chemistry and stuff. It's more important that you teach them, bring them up in the ways of the Lord, the spiritual things. If they're lacking a little bit in some other, skills for this world, who cares? They'll get by, they'll figure it out. They'll somehow, but make sure that they know the things of the Lord, and they're not going to be taught that. They're going to be brainwashed in public schools to follow the course of this world, to follow Satan, not believe the gospel, not get sound doctrine in the inner man, and they're all going to hell in a handbasket. So do whatever if you have to go out and live in the country and work like a dog all your life and just barely scrape by, but it means now you could be at home and teach your kids, do that. So that's the most important thing, other than, this being saved and coming into the knowledge of the truth. Get your kids out of public school. Whatever you need to do, get them out of that. And by doing that, it will also keep them away from the things like drugs and sexual sins and things, because you've shown them what's important isn't the things of this world and following your flesh. It's the things of God. That you give up the things of this world to raise them up spiritually, to have them at home. And you get to raise them up at home, and so they're going to behave better anyway because you're around them all the time. So it's just a win-win situation. Materially, it's not, but who cares about that stuff? Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. So you may go through trials and tribulations as a result of move out in the country and pulling your kids out of school, but and homeschooling them, but it'll work an eternal weight of glory for you. So that'd be the main advice. Get them out of, and also nowadays, I'd say, even if you say, well, I'll take them to a private school, I can afford that. No, I wouldn't do that either. Even if it's a Christian-run school, well, they're not going to brainwash them in evolution. They'll brainwash them in churchianity. And so then they end up becoming those legalistic parents when they grow up. So you want them to grow up in the things of the Lord, making the Bible their authority, not a religion, whether it be the religion of secular humanism that public schools teach, or the religion of churchianity that the church-run schools teach. You want them to be Bible believers. That's the most important thing. At the same time, I would try not to isolate them, because they still need to be around kids their own age. But again, if you're homeschooling them, they can still have friends, they can still spend time with them, but they'll make the right decisions if they've got the good spiritual groundwork that you've laid in them. The problem with isolating them is that they're going to have to get out in that world sometime and face issues. So whether it be in college, or whether it be when they become an adult and they're working a full-time job, they're gonna have all those temptations out there. And the temptations and the consequences of following those temptations are a lot worse when you're adult as opposed to when you're 8 or 9 years old, let's say. So if you give them the spiritual groundwork and at the same time don't isolate them and get them to follow sound doctrine, well then when it comes to making those decisions between right and wrong, they're going to choose the right over the wrong. They're more likely to do so anyway, I should say. If they're saved, they believe the clear gospel, they've got sound doctrine in the inner man, then when they make those moral decisions, they'll make the correct ones, more than likely. And they need to learn to make those decisions. You can't just isolate them and control them their entire lives, because there will come a point where they need to go out in the real world and make those decisions. So if they've already had some friends and they've not been isolated, then they're more likely to make good decisions with them, with the spiritual background, and then they'll be ready for the real world. So that's my advice for parents of young children. I know it's tough, but the main thing is getting them out of the course of this world. Thanks for watching.